An early morning, time-sensitive show. 2 cups of coffee? Let's see how it goes. So let's keep the San Francisco 49er theme going with a Bay Area Hall of Fame sports broadcaster whose career spanned 6 decades on TV and radio as a play-by-play announcer, color commentator, sports anchor, or as a show host. Robert Oliver Fouts, nickname Red Dog, or Bob. Bob was born in Sacramento, California in 1921 and went to the famed Christian Brothers High School. And in 1939, he accepted a journalism scholarship from St. Mary's College in Moraga, not far from his home, and would letter in baseball as the Gales' third baseman. He was also instrumental in starting St. Mary's first radio station. But college life would be put on hold with the outbreak of World War II. Bob Fouts enlisted in the Army Air Corps so he could serve his country, and after the war, Bob stayed on as a reservist for the next 30 years, retiring a full bird colonel. When he returned to the Bay Area after the war, Bob's career really took off. He got a job as an announcer for a brand new football team called the San Francisco 49ers, who were part of a brand new football league called the All-American Football Conference. This would be the spring of 1946. And it's at this time, a new guy in town named Bud Foster has just been hired by Oakland Oaks owner Brick Laws to call the Oaks baseball games. And by the time football season rolled around, Bud Foster was hired by the 49ers to sit alongside Bob Fouts in the booth. Together, they were the first announcers to call games for the San Francisco 49ers in club's history. My pop has Bud's autograph, and I did a show on him my season 4, and I mentioned how Bud called 49er games, but I didn't give him credit for being the first. The two worked together for a few years, calling 49er games, with Bob calling games off and on throughout the 50s, going back and forth from color to play-by-play, teaming up with different partners over his 20-plus years with the Niners. The classic duo, Bob Fouts and Lon Simmons, who is also a Hall of Fame broadcaster and a Bay Area legend. Bob Fouts also teamed up for a few seasons with 49er great Gordy Saltow. Bob's signature call? Red Dog, when describing an oncoming 49er blitz. At the end of my first season, I did a show on the 1957 49ers team-issued photo cards my dad has. One shows Bob Fouts and Lon Simmons and Coach Frank Albert. They look very uncomfortable posing for the photo. I also showed a very strange drawing of a player throwing a pass. It was a radio ad for the two announcers. Bob Fouts' last season calling 49er games would be 1960. Besides calling those early Niner games, Bob was calling basketball games for his alma mater, St. Mary's Gales, as well as the USF Dons, including the Dons' back-to-back championship seasons. Bob was at the right place at the right time, and was on the call for a young Bill Russell and the Dons, and watched them have a perfect 1955-56 season. The Bob Fouts autograph in the thumbnail? My pop? He got that March 8th, 1955. He was in 6th grade when him and his dad went to the Cow Palace near San Francisco to watch the NCAA Western Regionals. I saw a wrinkled program from that event on eBay for $1,000. Dad doesn't have that program, but he filled 6 pages in his autograph book with different players from 3 out of the 4 teams that played that day. He didn't get any of the Dons players because they had already signed it a few weeks prior to this game. And since my dad's autograph book is in chronological order, it makes it easy to look up the games, get the lineups, and match up the autograph to see who's who. There's over 30 autographs on those 6 pages. I really need to do another episode on that USF Dons team and show the page of autographs. Speaking of the USF Dons, let's get back to Bob Fouts, and let's go back to 1951 when he was calling Dons football games, including their historic 1951 season, which turned out to be the school's last. The team is simply known as the 51 Dons. They had a perfect season and later would be tagged with the moniker undefeated, untied, and uninvited. Uninvited because of the team's refusal to leave their 2 black players at home if the Dons wanted to play in the Orange Bowl. Like a group of brothers, the team stuck together and stayed home. Now, here's my 2 cents, brought to you by the High Life. This episode in college football history is pretty much forgotten and isn't talked about anymore, probably because it points out how backwards we were as a country, and nobody wants to talk about that. Yet, the other side of the story needs to be told, the human interest story of race relations, and how these young men were not backwards, but forward-thinking people, and how race didn't matter to these teammates. That should be remembered and talked about. How even back then, the unity among groups of people from all over the country who had different economic backgrounds and upbringings, as well as all the different religions and races, how they can come together, work together, and unify, making our country a better place to live in. So it's around this time in 1951 that one of Bob Fouts' 5 children is born. This one will follow in his footsteps by also becoming a great CBS NFL announcer in his own right. And the two would team up in the 1990s to become the first ever father-son duo to call an NFL game in the booth. But first, this little kid would be a 49er ball boy before growing up and making a name for himself in the NFL and going into a different Hall of Fame than his broadcaster dad. I'm talking about San Diego Chargers quarterback and NFL Hall of Famer Dan Fouts. His dad was one of the constant voices in sports for over 50 years in Northern California as an announcer or a sports anchor. Whether it was on TV, radio, or in the studio, he was known as a pro's pro with a great work ethic when it came to preparing for his job, and his job would entail a wide variety of sporting events, which is not always easy to do. He might have started out calling football and basketball games, but Bob Fouts was right at home, calling hockey, track and field, Seals baseball, a variety of Olympic events over the years. He's covered golf's majors like the US Open and the British Open, and even wrestling. Bob was calling San Francisco Warriors games in 1962 when they first moved into town during the Wilt Chamberlain years. And when I say right at home, sportscaster Barry Tompkins said this when praising Bob Fouts. It's like sitting around the table with your uncle. It wasn't like listening to a broadcaster broadcast a game. It was more like a family member telling you about the game. Me? That's what I want when listening to a game. Hall of Fame announcers can do that for hours on end without sounding robotic or boring. Howard Cosell was one of the all-time great boxing announcers, but could you listen to him doing baseball for 2+ hours? No way. Same for John Madden. When those guys did Monday Night Football, it was a hard listen, but they were entertaining, and that goes a long way. When Howard did Monday Night Football, the show was evened out with the great voice and delivery of Frank Gifford's play-by-play and the folksy fun of Dandy Don Meredith, keeping it light. A great trio, and it worked. I'll wrap up today's episode with another Willie Mays story. Or I should say encounter. Willie makes it into a lot of my shows. So I will leave you with this. A young Dan Fouts sees Willie Mays and goes up to the legend, and Dan introduces himself. Willie said, "You're Bob's kid." Little Dan says, "Yeah." Then Willie says, "Bob's a good man." Later in life, Dan Fouts would say that phrase, "he's a good man," would come up a lot when people talked about his dad. Dan said that meant more than anything. He also said the word great is thrown around a lot. This is great, that's great. But great is a comparison, and good is an attribute.